Hi, everyone, in POS 340. Greetings from my Airbnb in sunny Mexico. As we move into Module 4, in which we talk about internal conflicts, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about how the themes that we're exploring in this module, especially civil war, internal violence, and long term instability, how they're playing out in some pretty major events that are happening in the world right now. My background is in African politics, so that's my area of expertise. And I've been following the development of South Sudan for many years. It's the youngest country in the world, and it has a risk of renewed civil war that is very, very real. Despite a peace deal that was signed in 2018, the country remains incredibly unstable. Just last week, Vice President Riek Machar was placed under house arrest, raising fears that ethnic violence between the Dinka and the Nuer communities could explode once again. So, if you're trying to understand what's happening in South Sudan right now, Sudan used to be one giant country in which the power and the money was concentrated in people who were more of Arab descent. And they were part of the ruling party, and then the indigenous African communities, the Dinka, who have higher poverty rates and typically are farmers, were often fighting to get land access for all of their herds. So this is an ongoing challenge between the Arab Sudanese and what you would call the Dinka Sudanese or the darker skinned Sudanese that's been going on since at least the 1950s, which led to South Sudan declaring independence. But it hasn't solved any of the problems. All it's really done is introduced a new international border into the conflict. And as we discussed in this fourth module, civil wars are distinct from international conflicts. They often emerge from internal political grievances, long standing in South Sudan, check, ethnic divisions, long standing in South Sudan, check. By the way, Dinkas tend to be Christian, the ruling Arabs tend to be Muslim, so you also have religious divisions and power struggles, exactly what we're seeing in South Sudan. So the situation there is a great example of what Clapham has called opportunistic violence, where leaders may exploit unrest to consolidate power or to settle scores. And as you'll see in the Congo case study this week, civil wars don't always end cleanly. In fact, almost never. They tend to morph into long-term humanitarian crises. And when a civil war wraps up, even if there's not active killing anymore, all of that is usually replaced with a different sort of human rights crisis instead. So then also, most of my students at ASU now are following events in Ukraine, and the war with Russia continues to devastate civilian life for Ukrainians. A recent report focused on the forced relocation and abuse of Ukrainian children who were taken into Russian custody, and in one case, a teenager was forcibly adopted, subjected to abuse, and pressured to abandon her national identity. And that's raising concerns in the human rights world about if this is an isolated case or if there is now concerted Russian ethnic cleansing of the Ukrainian identity. This connects to both Module 1's human rights frameworks and Module 4's patterns of destruction and war. The targeted displacement of children isn't just a war crime, it's a deliberate strategy to erase cultural identity and fracture future generations. In civil and international conflicts alike, civilians, the more vulnerable the civilian is, the more they suffer. So lastly, we recently in the last few weeks, we've seen renewed global attention to Hong Kong and Tibet, where the Chinese government is being sanctioned by the US for political repression. These actions are part of a larger pattern of what we examine in Module 2, which is state repression as a trigger for political violence. But these three issues, South Sudan, Ukraine, and China, Hong Kong, Tibet, they also relate to this week's content, in which even in places where civil war is not formally declared. In fact, most conflicts and most civilian deaths take place out of an officially declared war. Internal conflict can simmer beneath the surface through surveillance, censorship, and violence against dissenters. And these are, I would call them quieter forms of internal repression that often precede or replace this overt open warfare that you tend to read about in the news so often. So as you dig into Module 4, I encourage you to reflect on what all of these cases have in common, which is the very blurry line between state power and human rights violations. To what degree, this is the question, the philosophical question for a course. To what degree do states need to curb individual liberties for the sake of stability, and how much curbing of individual liberties for the sake of state stability is acceptable before it becomes just rampant human rights violations? The long-term consequences of internal conflicts that we're studying in this course pose immense challenges for rebuilding, even when the conflict is theoretically on paper over. So looking ahead to your Convene the Council assignment due this week, these cases that I just mentioned can help provide some useful reference points as you step into the role of an international policymaker when you play Convene the Council online. And as you play and you fill out the Convene the Council worksheet, ask yourselves, what drives civil wars to keep going? That's a question of duration of conflict. And what kind of interventions or mistakes can help bring them to an end? Political scientists tend to study the onset of a conflict and the duration of a conflict separately, even though they're also, of course, very mutually constitutive. Thank you so much for listening, and keep up the great work.